Here we are at the halfway point in the season of Lent. For 3 Sundays already, we've focused on the theme, letting go and making space. And I wonder if you've noticed how we are letting go of things up here in our visuals and making more space. Have you noticed that? Letting go, making space. And there have been questions every Sunday, and I noticed as I prepared for this sermon that I have a lot of questions. What is it that we are letting go of? What are we making space for? What do we need to let go of to create space for others? They're all good questions, I think. But then, when I read through the worship resources that we've been using, I found the question for today. What is it worth? And then, the writers of our worship resources wrote a whole series of questions. They wrote, where do we place our worth? Do we place worth in our possessions? Do we place worth in our relationships, in our power? Do we place worth in our military might? Do we place worth in the strength of our economy? How about in our nation, or in the community, or in our work? Where do we place our worth? What do we value? And now we have a whole lot of really good questions. Lots of questions. So many questions. But I think it's time to let go of some of these questions and make some space. So, when I spent time just sitting with this text, the phrase all in came to mind. And I was noticing that these verses, in different ways, all have something to do with being all in. The phrase all in can mean different things to different people, and different things at different times to different people. So I ask you, what does it mean to you today to be all in? What comes to your mind when you hear that phrase? All in. Any short answers out there? All in. Committed. Present. Good. I'd also thought about those. It means, to me, total commitment. All in. Total commitment. It can also mean everything's been given. Everything's already been poured out. Everything's been done. Complete. I've given it all I've got to give. All in. Today's scriptures begin with a story and end with a story, and both in their own ways are all about all in. The first story begins with, what else? A question, right? There was a scribe who had heard Jesus answering the questions of other religious leaders, and he was listening closely. And this scribe came to respect the wisdom of Jesus' answers. So he approached Jesus, and he asked, what is the greatest commandment? And in this story, as Mark tells it, other religious leaders have asked Jesus plenty of questions before. We've heard some of those questions. Oftentimes, their motives were to try to trick Jesus. The scribe, though, he came with a sincere question. Earlier, Jesus had answered these questions that were intended to trick Jesus. He'd answered them with other questions or with parables that were maybe a little hard to understand. But this time, when the scribe came to him answering a sincere question, Jesus gave him a clear and straightforward answer. He said, the first and greatest command is the one that all faithful Jews recite every single day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. But he didn't stop there, did he? He said, and there's a second one. It's really important. It's very close to being like loving God. It is to love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and all the prophets hang on these two commandments. If you are keeping these two commandments, you're in a good spot to be able to keep all the other ones. I've been using an online resource that comes from Biola University for my Lenten devotionals. And I like these devotionals because along with the scripture every day, they have the usual reflections on that scripture, but they also include artwork and poetry and music. And yesterday, when I had today's message close to ready, and I opened this devotional, and I saw there featured the artwork of Robert Indiana. Yes, that's his name. Don't get confused as I tell this story. It's not our state. Robert Indiana is his name. And I mention this because I had used his artwork on the slide that you're seeing. In the center of that graphic is the word love. You see it? This is the work of Robert Indiana. The devotional actually pictured his steel sculpture that is now in the hands of the Indianapolis Museum of Art. But Robert Indiana didn't begin with the steel sculpture I was seeing. He began with this very graphic design that was to become the Museum of Modern Art's most popular Christmas card. I didn't know anything about Robert Indiana until I read yesterday's devotional. So that was a little side trail that I just took you on. You're welcome. The author of the scriptural reflections for that devotional was Barry Bishop. She is the director of Talbot School of Theology's Department of Marriage and Family Theology, which is a department of Biola University. Now that's a long title. She wrote yesterday's scriptural reflections, and the scripture was on 1 Corinthians. So the love chapter, we know it as the love chapter. But she also made mention of today's scripture. And I want to read a little bit of what she wrote. Scripture seems to make a big deal about love. Love, according to 1 Corinthians 13, includes both action and inaction. It is not a feeling, but rather a doing. Jesus talks about love frequently and elevates love to be the greatest action we can do. As I hold the greatest commandment in my mind, I see that there are three components to the action of love: loving God, loving your neighbor, and loving yourself. Jesus seems to be asking us to love quite a bit. In Scripture and in practice, they all seem to depend upon one another, and we can only love out of a love that we have received from God. And she's referring to 1 John 4, 7 through 21 there, where it says that love is of God. So, I noticed, well, to be fair, it's easy to say there's only two commandments, but I noticed this morning when Mark asked the children, who do you love? Nobody said, I love myself. Right? But we're called to love ourselves too. Keep that in mind. Back to Barry Bishop. She quotes a neuropsychologist by the name of Donald Hebb, who said, neurons that fire together wire together. Our neurons in our brains, when they fire together, they get wired together. So this is the science of how habits are formed. To put it simply, the more we do something, the easier it is to do something. Well, duh, you might be thinking. Why'd you bring that up, Donna? Well, stick with me here. If love is a verb, it is something that we do. it's something we practice. So the more we act kindly, the more we do justice, the more we practice patience, the more we rejoice in the truth, the more we do that, the easier it gets to act kindly and to do mercy and to practice patience and to rejoice in the truth. And the converse is true as well. The more we're being rude or boastful or we're rejoicing in the sufferings of others, well, the easier it gets to be rude and boastful and to be a selfish person. When I hear the first and the greatest commandment is to love God with everything I've got, my first reaction, to be honest with you, is a kind of hopelessness. I know. You don't see it. Maybe. I hope you don't see it. But I know how often I fail. I know how often I do things to serve myself. Even when those things on the surface might seem like I'm doing it for the good of others. And I usually know my motives. I know my motives, and they're all too mixed. And I know that that's true for you too. So, how can I possibly love God with everything I've got when my motives are mixed and I know the worst about myself? And then I begin to tell myself all kinds of horrible things about myself, things that aren't really even true, because I'm such a failure at loving God perfectly. But to understand that love is a verb and that this is a learning process, that God is teaching us to love throughout our lives. This gives me hope. The more we practice loving God and neighbor and self, the better our loving becomes. When we intentionally practice love, we are cooperating with God. God is teaching. We are learning. We're cooperating with the process. Learning to love is a process, and I am encouraged. I think in these two greatest commandments, God is inviting us to be all in as we learn to love. Totally committed to the learning and all in with the process. So let's take a look at loving ourselves. Think about how you love yourself. Some of us major in loving ourselves too well, and some of us suffer thanks to the selfishness of loving ourselves too well. But some of us major in not loving ourselves well at all, and others as well as ourselves, others as well as ourselves suffer from the result of our low self-esteem. Most of us waver between the two. Sometimes we love ourselves too much, and sometimes not enough. How do you love yourself? What's the way you normally love yourself? Would your neighbor want to be loved the way you love yourself? Well, that's a question worth pondering, isn't it? I have 3 stories to share with you. The first one comes from a friend who gave me permission to tell you her story of loving herself well. It was in the early years of her marriage. A friend from her workplace was in need of a place to stay. She talked it over with her husband, and together they decided that they could share their apartment with him. They had 3 bedrooms. The smallest one they were using as an art studio. And they decided that, he was in a hard place right now, and he could have the second bedroom. So we moved in. And while he lived with him, his world just got smaller and smaller and smaller. He lost his job. He became estranged from his family. He shut out his other friends until he got to the point that my friend and her husband seemed to be the only friends and the only social life that he had. One day, after having taken the bus to go downtown, my friend came back and she found herself annoyed seeing his car parked in the very same place that it had been parked at for days. He hadn't been in his car. He hadn't moved it. So by the time she walked through the door to her apartment, she had decided that she had to do something about this annoyance she was feeling. And she told the man, she found the man and she sat him down and she told him, I can't live like this anymore. I'm going to go back downtown. I'm going to be gone for 2 hours. By the time I return, you need to have a plan that includes how to go about finding a job, finding another place to live, and finding friends that don't include us. She left. She went back to the bus stop. She went downtown. She got herself a cup of coffee. She sat there and drank it slowly. She got back on the bus. She returned home. She walked home from the bus stop to her house. And when she got into her apartment, she realized that the man was gone. There was no note. He did not return that night. The next morning, she asked herself, what have I done? She knew the man had been depressed. This was in the days before cell phones. She had no way to contact him. And over the next few days, her worry just increased. What have I done? Then he walked back into the apartment. Thank you, he said. All my life I've been waiting. I've been waiting for someone to be firm with me all my life. Thank you. Because you told me what I had to do, I did it. I found a job. On Friday, I will move my things out of your house, out of your home, and into my own apartment. And I know how I will begin to socialize again. But can we still be friends? And my friend was glad to say, of course, we've always been friends. We're still friends. My friend had been looking out for herself. She was loving herself well, in noticing what she needed and acting upon it. She took care of not only herself, but she helped this man. She had no idea that loving herself well would also help him. We need to love ourselves well so that we can love others well. The second story comes from my husband, with his permission. Conrad was a music teacher before he became a pastor. He was teaching in an elementary school, and he was in the early stages of preparing for a middle school musical. One 5th grade boy came to him, asking to be considered for one of the solos. He was a great kid. Only problem was that he couldn't carry a tune. Well, he could if the tune only contained one note. Dun! Conrad could have found a way to let him down gently. But he put himself in this eager boy's shoes, and he made a different decision. With the parents' permission, Conrad made a commitment to drive that boy home after school every day and use the time to work with him. Conrad would hum a pitch, and the boy would try to match it. And then Conrad would hum a pitch, and the boy would try to match it. And Conrad would hum a pitch, and he matched it. And then he'd hum a pitch, and the boy would try to match it. You get the idea. Days of driving him home after school with this happening. But then one day, Conrad hummed a pitch, and the boy hummed the pitch. And the boy heard his voice change to that pitch. And they began to work with it. There was something to work with. And that boy did get to sing a solo. He didn't go on to become an opera star or anything like that. But he sung a solo and he experienced success. Conrad had loved that little boy, his neighbor, as himself. The third story comes from today's text, and you've already heard it. The story is about the woman who gave her last 2 cents to God. She'd given everything she had to give. She was all in. Jesus commended her, saying that she'd given more than all the rich people who had obviously put much more in dollar value, or whatever the value of their, what it was called, but the economic value of the rich people had put in way more. But they had not put in generosity. They had not put in love. They'd given out of their surplus, maybe with little thought or even little love. But she would have had to have thought deeply about this giving because it was all she had. And she gave it. She was left with no money. But love, now that's a different matter. The more love we give, the more we have. This poor woman gave out of her love for God, and Jesus commends her for that. But that's not the whole story, is it? You see, there was this thing called the temple tax. This tax was used for the upkeep of the temple. People, whether rich or poor or somewhere in between, were expected to pay this tax. Priests, however, they were exempt. They didn't have to pay anything. It is possible, Scripture doesn't say this, but it is all too possible that this poor woman was paying her temple tax. It's also possible at the very same time that she was paying it out of her love for God. Out of her love for God, she was contributing toward the upkeep of the temple. But it's all too possible that this was not simply an offering, that this was her temple tax. Now, earlier in the story, in the scripture that you heard today, Jesus had been talking about the religious leaders. Do you remember that? I'm going to use a paraphrase from a source that I like called Laughing Bird to remind you about this part of the story. It not only will help to remind you, but it helps us to hear it in a little different way. A large crowd was gathered around Jesus in the temple to hear what he had to teach. He said to them, "Don't get sucked in by high-flying religious experts. They love cultivating an image of profound sophistication and basking in the adulation of a gullible public. They get a kick out of always being invited to appear at openings and premieres. At formal occasions, they proudly take their place among the distinguished guests. But behind the scenes, they are taking advantage of the weak and the vulnerable, exploiting them for all their worth. Their long and polished public prayers are a mask. They'll get what's coming to them eventually." These religious leaders, who should have been taking care of the least among them, should have been looking out for poor widows. They were not loving their neighbors well, were they? And by not loving their neighbors, they were not loving God well either. And truth be told, they really weren't loving themselves very well. I've asked a lot of questions this morning and given you a lot to think about. sermons don't take the route that you think they're going to take. When I first looked at today's question, what is it worth? I thought, okay, that's the direction I need to go. And I haven't exactly gone that way, but I sort of have. So as you enter the silence this morning, you may look at the beautiful artwork that Lauren has made for us again, and you can think about, what is your dollar value really worth to you? You can think about, what are you worth to yourself? Or what is your neighbor worth to you? Or what is God worth to you? Pay attention to where the Spirit seems to be taking you. And spend some time with God and your thoughts in the silence of the next few moments. And I'll close the time with prayer.